Cool. Perfect. All right. So firstly, before we start, I just want to say thank you for doing this, Helen. Thank you for your time. Sometimes I can forget to do that. So if I put it in at the beginning, I find it really helpful. So Helen helps women after a abusive relationship to heal without becoming victims or bitches. Would you say that that is the kind of monarch that you use?
Yeah, pretty much. You don't need to toughen up. You don't need to react or start become nasty and things in order to heal. In fact, it doesn't help.
Okay, cool. All right, so let's explore a little bit about what got you into this, why you feel this is an area to address or work on, and then perhaps some of the common problems you notice that people bump into after going through an abusive relationship. So tell me a little bit about your background, Helen.
Absolutely. I spent almost 10 years in the police in London, where I was a detective. I specialised in domestic violence and sexual offences. From a more personal note, there are several members of my family, close family, who have experienced domestic violence. My mum, her first marriage was quite abusive, and I've experienced of seeing personally as well the effects, long-term effects of abuse when it's not properly addressed.
Okay. Okay. So could you tell me a little bit, what do you mean by the long-term effects of abuse?
Well, traumas like abuse in relationships can become generational. So, what often happens is if a trauma, if an abusive relationship is not healed from, um, people can often um, see behaviors in other people that aren't necessarily there. So they're triggers. People are triggered, and it you're reliving the stress. So the stress response in your body never goes away until you deal with it. What can then happen is you see abuse in other people's relationships that aren't there.
Right.
If, for example, if someone is talking to you about um, their relationship, and a tiny reminder reminds you of your unconsciously reminds you of that past abusive relationship, then you can become triggered and assume the other person is in an abusive relationship where they might not be. They might be, but if you're being triggered, chances are that they're actually not, and it's your perfectly natural emotional response to being triggered. But the purpose of the trigger and the emotional response is to remind you that you haven't dealt with the problem. So if you're still being triggered by past relationships, if you're still talking about, it could be a present relationship, and it doesn't necessarily, of course, need to be with a partner. It could be a family member. But if you're still being triggered and you're talking a lot about problems in a relationship that are potentially abusive or violent, well, violence is slightly different, but if you're still complaining about past relationships, then that suggests that you are still triggered and you're not You haven't overcome it, and until you deal with that, you are still going to live with the pain and the stress in your body, and over a long term, that can have huge physical impact on your health, your mental health, and you could pass those behaviours on to your children, to family members around you, um, and it can go on for generations if it's not dealt with. It may be that you teach unconsciously um, the people around you either how to treat you or how to be treated. So if you have young children, it may be that the way that you're responding may be as a result of a trigger. But if what your children will generally do is they will copy what you're doing, and if your response is potentially an unhealthy response, then they may learn that unhealthy response.
Mm.
It can be generational.
Yeah, I like what you said. There was a couple of things that you said there that I thought were really quite poignant. One of them was if you're still triggered by something, then ultimately it hasn't been resolved.
Mm.
I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge, not just in the case of domestic abuse or abusive relationship, but in any interaction. If you're triggered, you're being shown where you're still holding on to something, where you still haven't dealt with something. But we seem to be in a time where people have to put trigger warnings on posts. We have to automatically kind of be aware of offense all the time, as opposed to recognizing, well, we kind of just show each other what we've got there. Um,
Mm.
so, yeah, it does seem you use the terminology without being victims, that it's very easy to slip into that, even from a societal perspective, that we're
Mm.
all victims to what other people say. So, yeah, it's a very, very poignant point. You also mentioned, I tend to call it kind of loyalty to stories. So,
Mm.
when we look at our past experience with our parents and growing up, commonly those patterns will be generational as well. It's not just our own childhood. Our parents will model their childhood onto us. So
Mm.
I suppose ultimately we look at, can we be the ones to break that pattern?
Yeah.
Do you find though, Helen, that one of the tricky things is sometimes people talking about their past abusive relationship, the difficulties they've had, can be a way of getting connection. So it becomes their go to.
Absolutely. And actually, I'm really glad you mentioned that. Um, Talking about um, past pains and traumas and situations like that, yes, it can absolutely be a way of gaining connection, of gaining sympathy, and um, often people are very interested in hearing stories like those. And there are several problems with um, talking to people about your past traumas. Um, of course, bottling it up is not healthy either.
Mm.
Um, but some of the issues with talking to people about that are untrained about dealing with about your past traumas are that um, their responses aren't necessarily a response that's going to help you.
Mm.
Um, I know personally there's I can count on my hand the number of people that I will talk to about a problem um, because of their response to me. They're not going to hook into to my story, as you said. There are two sides
Mm.
to every situation. Actually, debatably, there's multiple facets, but
Yeah.
um, even even knowing what I know, I'm still very capable when I'm stressed or when I'm feeling victimized
Yeah.
um, to to go off and I will see a limited view of what's going on. I won't see the whole story, and I may make assumptions and I may jump to conclusions. Um, Perfectly normal and unconscious responses.
Mm.
But if you're not selecting the right people to talk to, then it can be unhelpful for you. It can be unhelpful for them. If they've got an unresolved trigger, then you can get into this drama cycle, and you can perpetuate your own trauma and the other person's. And talking over and over again about a problem that hasn't been resolved, it I mean, if you talk about a trauma and it leaves, if you imagine it leaves a groove, let's say in the sand, if there's a groove in the sand, and every time you talk about it, it gets deeper, and the groove gets deeper, and then it gets deeper every time you talk about it without it being resolved. At some point, you're not going to be able to get out of that groove. You might not even see you're getting into a groove, but you may get stuck if you're not dealing with the trauma. If you're not speaking to somebody who understands how to help you talk about it.
Yeah. Would you say that's one of the problems when people choose to talk to friends or family? What quick happens is they flip to the mode of trying to fix or rescue, as opposed to just listening to you and allowing you to just share what's going on and actually just kind of just be there with you. Often they go into trying to change it, don't they? Okay.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. When you were talking about grooves or impressions in the sand, it reminded me of, in the Yoga Sutras, it talks about something called samskaras, grooves or impressions in the mind. And we go down those particular routes so commonly because we don't realize them. And so it is a process of kind of getting out of those. Yeah, so it's interesting how they come together. Anyway, let's get back to your time in the police. Okay. How much was domestic abuse or abusive relationships something that you were encountering or having to deal with?
A lot.
Right.
Yeah, it was pretty common, and what was probably not now surprising, but it was surprising at the time, how many people were repeat victims. So
Okay.
being a um, being a repeat victim, of course, is where you're either in different relationships. You leave a relationship thinking that's going to solve the problem, but you still have probably developed some coping mechanisms to deal with the situation that you were in that might have been, on a very short term, might have helped you feel safer, but in the long term, they're not either healthy for a healthy relationship, or they're just not good for you. And again, if you just leave a relationship and don't deal with any of the issues, you are then likely to take that into another relationship, or you might not get into a relationship because you will then see issues that are that remind you of a past trauma.
Okay.
And I mean, I said it's un it's unusual, but there's a lot of the time, if people are experiencing an abusive relationship, whether it's a partner or a family member, or could be from past, from school or something, or a bully, those it's rarely just happens the once, because often we think, okay, well, I'll get out of that situation and I'll be fine because it wasn't my fault, and you may be right that it's not your fault, and you may have developed behaviours that are or developed coping strategies really to deal with it, that if you don't then deal with and heal from, then you can go on to relationships with a boss. It might be that a boss then or a co-worker then speaks to you in a way, and you can either, I mean, when I say about becoming a bitch, if you're then triggered and your response is to go rah, then that's what I mean by becoming a bitch. It's not necessarily that you are permanently a bitch. We're all capable of going into that
Yeah.
that type of that character. Um, and it's perfectly natural response. If you feel threatened, and you've left a situation and you go into a new situation, your thought process may be, okay, I'm not gonna allow myself to do that again. So I'm going to go, right, I'm going to toughen up, and no one's going to speak to me that way again. Now the thought process is fine, but if your response is then with potentially aggression, um, well intended, but if your response is aggression, then you're likely to be met with more aggression.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting actually, because I always think of that as you're trying to move on from it, but you're
Hmm,
actually still being driven by it.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, what was it that you were experiencing with these? I don't want to make the assumption that it was all women. Was there a combination, or was it majority women that you were dealing with in these relationships?
Yeah, there was definitely a split.
There was.
Um,
Okay, that's interesting.
there was a lot of women. There was a lot of men, and quite often the situation it wasn't one-sided in the sense of you've got two people who are reacting to each other and becoming volatile towards each other. So it's a mutual um, cycle. I said most of the situations that I saw, the behaviours themselves were unconscious. They weren't malicious. They weren't someone who was a nasty bastard, or it wasn't somebody who was intentionally being horrible to someone else. It was usually unconscious behaviours um, that are triggered from their own past, and then you get a situation where two people are fighting with each other as opposed to one
Yeah.
aggressor on a victim, as it were.
Yeah. See, I one of my favorite expressions is we can't be held accountable for that which we're not aware of.
Hmm.
And sometimes our own behavior patterns, we're not aware of them,
Yeah.
particularly if we fall into the groove of always blaming someone else for our behaviors, which can manifest in people as well,
Mm.
can't it? You made me feel is a common one. Or, well,
Yeah.
because you did this, that's why I did that.
Mm.
Those things appear in relationships a lot as well. Okay, so if you've made this transition from working with people in the police who've been through domestic abuse or abusive relationships, there must have been something that you saw. You thought, okay, this isn't the right approach. This isn't working. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I got really frustrated by quite a few things in the police. One, that I was really limited to um, prosecuting to a certain to to put it bluntly. Um, I mean, it was slightly different in the domestic violence unit because it was understood that a lot of people don't want to prosecute. And whilst the police do in England, they do have the power to prosecute without a victim's will. It's rarely done because it's not constructive.
Right.
Um, but I got really frustrated that I wasn't able to help as many people as I could. And when I was in the police, I started training to be a coach. So I was training in NLP and hypnotherapy um, and some other things. And I really got frustrated with the the limited help that I could be. I mean, I obviously got to interview both parties in depth and to understand what was going on for them at the time, what was going on around the situation. I mean, people was quite happy to talk to me for hours about what was going on because they could feel that I was genuinely interested in what was going on and not there to prosecute them, as it were. Um, and in my capacity as a detective, I was severely limited as to how I was allowed to help. Um, and then as I did more training and I understood more about how our behaviours work and how our mind works um, and all the intricacies about that, I realised how much easier it is to actually resolve the problems. And as most of the behaviours are unconscious, the solutions are generally unconscious as well, which
Okay.
is another reason why talking about the situation isn't actually likely to help.
Okay.
And yeah, so I was mostly frustrated about the limit to one as to how I could help, even with say domestic violence charities. Um, Now, all of the organisations that deal with domestic violence are very, very well intentioned, and they do help a lot of people. So I really don't want to knock them. They do a fabulous job in some respects. They are obviously there as a short-term bandage, um, and some of the things that I hear and I see that charities are saying, um, they don't necessarily help the recovery. So there's a lot of assumptions, for example, about um, the the aggressor, the perpetrator, however they phrase it. There's a lot of assumption about the intention of the other person, um, and again, that doesn't help the person who's being victimised. Um, if they then are taking responsibility away and placing it completely on the other person, then that takes away their power and their capacity to change. Because if you feel you are in no way responsible for what's going on for you, then in theory you are taking away from them the capacity to know that actually you can do something about it. And you don't need to toughen up. You don't need to be all aggressive. You can still be a kind, loving person if that's who you are. Um, and so that those sort of things really frustrate me about the charities. And of course, a lot of coaches that I see that specialise in domestic violence, again with the best intentions in the world. And it's what I see often is that people who have been through the situation before, so it's fantastic that they are no longer in a situation that they are being abused or feeling victimized. But it's easy to see that they themselves are often still stuck because they haven't healed from the trauma. They may not be in the situation anymore. Um, so whilst they may very well be able to help somebody who's at a different point, who may still be in the situation, they're not going to be able to help them truly heal and overcome the trauma itself. Um, and I don't believe that surviving abuse is an option. I, who wants to survive? I want to have a wonderful life. I want to thrive. Um, and I, that's my intention to help as many people as possible to thrive after they've experienced abuse in a relationship, not just survive.
Yeah. So would you say that the charities have a tendency to perpetuate the story of victimhood for these people?
Unintentionally, yes.
Right.
Um, I mean, there are lots of reasons that um, people become aggressive
Yeah.
and take things out on inevitably the person closest to them. So this is where it's usually a partner or a close family member. Um, and often those, I mean, we've seen it with, of course, the latest COVID situation, that um, domestic violence went through the roof, and it's because of stress. Is it an excuse? No, absolutely not. Does it make it okay? Absolutely not. But it is the reason, it's the trigger that have taken people from being able to cope with whatever situation they're in to no longer being able to cope and going, and then their stress response is aggression. Do they need to deal with it? Absolutely. But the fact remains, the what triggers it is often stress in relation to maybe a past trauma of their own. I do hear an awful lot of people saying that their partner had a parent or a sibling or someone in their life who was a narcissist. And
I
think
hear that term a lot. Now, I'm glad you said that actually, because I hear this. I think that what started to happen is words that used to be reserved for a psychotherapeutic environment as a result of a diagnosis with an expert have now started to be chucked around as uneducated diagnoses of people. And I think that's potentially quite dangerous, actually.
it really is, and especially if you look at a perfectly normal, natural stress response, a lot of those behaviours that are perfectly normal responses to stress, that describes a narcissist. When you're stressed, you often go into a situation where you are laser focused. You can't see anyone else's perspective. It's
Yeah.
not if you feel threatened, it's not sensible for your brain to be able to empathize with the other person, because if you have to fight your way out of a situation, then it's really not useful for you to think, oh yeah, but if I hurt them, then they might feel bad or whatever. But your brain switches off your capacity to feel empathy. So it's not necessarily that somebody on a long-term permanent scale is a narcissist, but if they're going through a stress response, they can't necessarily empathize with the other person and see it from their perspective, because their brain has switched off that capacity.
Yeah, I like what you're saying. I think it's quite common when we're feeling like a heightened level or kind of a higher level of stress that we revert to a behavior to try and change our experience. Sometimes it will be if I fight back against what's happening, I can then feel better again. Other people do the opposite and they go into a space of like trying to run away, or there's a term called facade. So they kind of put on a bit of an act to try and manipulate in order that they can try and get things under control. And I think we all fall prey to different patterns, but we kind of have to see our patterns before we can address them. The problem comes when we see our patterns but blame other people for them.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what would you say are signs that somebody has unresolved issues that keep appearing in relationships?
So what someone is going to see, or how to recognise someone's behaviour?
Yeah, just some ways that, because as we sort of said earlier, it's quite common to sit behind blame as opposed to acknowledge, this is my experience. What have I not learned to be okay with? It's quite common to say, you made me feel. This is a very common language pattern I hear.
Yeah.
And what are some common signs that someone's got unresolved stuff, but they keep bumping into it in relationships, but blaming others for it? I suppose that's a sign straight away, isn't it? Let's say, are there some things to look out for that are potentially showing that, look, you've got some unresolved stuff to deal with?
Well, one of the main things is that if someone is continually feeling triggered and emotional, then if there is something, it doesn't, however small, that is making them just go, I mean, it could be if someone's feeling anxious, if something is repeatedly making you feel anxious about something, if you're not expressing yourself, if something's going on and then you might be holding back, as you said, withdrawing and saying or doing nothing, And that can be another sign. And again, another one is if you're off blurting out and really losing control. A number of people I hear say, I just lost it with so and so. That's often a sign that there's a trigger there that hasn't been resolved. And of course, if there's lots of relationships in your life where you feel either powerless or you feel quite aggressive, then that suggests that there's some triggers that you've not dealt with.
Nice. That's useful. And are there some signs you could suggest that point to someone has kind of rooted themselves in I'm a victim of? And are there some signs that kind of show that someone's fallen into that trap of becoming overly defensive, let's say, rather than bitchy? Not everyone likes that word.
Yeah. I mean, if there's a big difference between being a victim and being victimized. I mean, you can be victimized without being a victim. If someone's bullying you, or if you were robbed or something like that, then you have been victimized. But you don't necessarily have to go into victim. Or if you go into the victim, then you go in short term. When you're stuck, what often happens, the signs are, you have a lot of sort of woe is me type moments. And this is often where you see people talking a lot about how bad it was for you and how bad the other person did whatever it was to you. And they talk about it a lot.
You see that on social media a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you can have some secondary gain, they call it, when you have a problem that was you were victimized, and there is a benefit to being a victim. And that is where, like you mentioned earlier, where you are getting attention, people are connecting with you. You see it in forums. Again, there's a lot of forums helping people to deal with domestic violence, narcissism, narcissists, and such like. And often what you see in these forums is people telling stories about how they have been a victim. And it goes on, and then they see somebody else's post, and they get hooked into it. So they're perpetuating this cycle without ever actually dealing with it or leaving the situation. So social media has lots of wonderful things, and it also has lots of ways of helping people remain stuck. If you're getting lots of attention, and that makes you feel validated, that makes you feel, it wasn't me, and that may be true. It may not have been your fault. You may have been legitimately victimized, and you may not have had any fault per se in what happened. But if you're then going to remain a victim, then the other person's still winning. You're not winning because you're still stuck in a victim. If you want, what would be much healthier for you is or the person will be to move on from the situation, to resolve and heal the pain and trauma. And
Let me just pause you for a second there, because there's something for me that's really important what you've just said, that any learned behavior that brings us some degree of connection can be quite hard to put down. I think as humans, we long for connection. So our learned ways of getting connection, even if they're unhealthy, they still bring us it, don't they? So that can be, have you experienced this? That can be the challenge in putting it down, is you may have to deal with this feeling of being alone more so than if you were to continue those behaviors. And I think that's, to me, I think that's important. There's a little bit of a time of feeling alone as you start to find new ways of connecting, find new
Mm.
people to connect with.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And there's lots of funny things that our brain does to try and help protect us
Yeah.
from situations. And again, it's all done unconsciously. Most of it done unconsciously. And there's one really interesting one that's your brain will actually stop you from remembering situations where that will help make you feel bad, or it may in your story it may forget elements that you have done something to assist in that situation, and all your brain is doing is trying to protect you, so you don't feel bad. It's trying to maintain um, your image of yourself. And again, it's not
Yeah.
necessarily a conscious thing where someone forgets that they did something that, or said something that might not have been ideal in the situation. But um, yeah, as you said, if you then get stuck in the situation without acknowledging um, the trigger, there's so many times that our emotions are signs that there's something for us to address. And if you're feeling hugely emotional, or you're often feeling really emotional, then it's just your body giving you additional signs that there's something to address. And of course, if you don't address them, the signs will get bigger and bigger and bigger. Um,
And do
and
they
eventually,
manifest in the body? Because I always think anything unresolved um, on an emotional level will start to manifest itself in the body as physical tightness, tension, postural habits and patterns. Why I think it's important that stuff is addressed as well. You
absolutely, and
notice that as well? Have you noticed that people that get a little bit stuck in victim mode tend to adopt a certain postural pattern?
yeah. And I know there's been an awful lot of um, an awful lot of studies done demonstrating how long-term unresolved trauma can cause disease in your
Mm.
body. Um, I'm not suggesting it's the only reason that someone might develop a cancer or an illness or a disease of any description. I'm not a medical doctor anyway, so but there's been an awful lot of reliable studies to show how disease or how stress and trauma impact your health, your physical health, and your body.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's something important in that message in that usually by the time it's manifested in the body, we will have been ignoring it at a mental and emotional level for quite some time anyway.
Yeah.
It's almost like often it's our suffering is necessary for us to pay attention, otherwise we can
Mm.
carry on, can't we? So what are some signs that someone has moved over towards that mentality of being um, more of a bitch? I'm going to use that word.
Um, that you'll often see when people are getting stuck in that mode is they can actually start being aggressive towards other people. That might be that they're accusing other people of things. That might be reflecting issues that they're having onto, or projecting issues that they're going through onto someone else. So it might be that um, I'm feeling angry, or I'm feeling um, hurt by something, so I'm going to say that you're doing it, or I see something in a behaviour in myself that I don't like, but what is actually happening is you're telling the other person that I don't like this in you, and it may be that you're seeing what you're actually doing is you're projecting your own issue
Mm.
onto them. It may not actually be doing it. It might be, but so that's another sign. Um, and again, when there's situations when someone's not demonstrating any empathy or understanding that there may be another situation, another side of the story. If someone is closed off to a possibility other than their assumption of what's happening,
Yeah.
and that's where you find people who are they're saying that the person's intentions were nasty, they were malicious. Um, Most of the time, in my experience, that if I don't think I can think of one where someone was genuinely, intentionally being nasty, but it was usually a response to something else. Um, and so when you see other people's intentions as primarily malicious, instead of seeing that there is another alternative, something else might be going on for them. Now, a lot of the time, people will go into this mode temporarily, which is perfectly normal. But when it happens all the time, and when you're assuming everyone around you is nasty, I used to hear one comment was, "All men are bastards." No, they're not, and that's when someone is stuck in that mode. Um, can some men be, or can all men at some point be? Yes. Can all women at some point be a bitch? Yes. That doesn't mean that all men are bastards or all women are bitches or that sort of thing. We're all capable of nipping into it. But if we're then stuck in a thought process that has everyone else being either an aggressor or something like that, then that's a sign that someone's stuck in bitch mode, as it were.
Okay. So, Helen, if somebody has reached that stage, right, where they're aware that, okay, I've been trapped in this victim space, or I've been acting as a bitch, I've been there for a while as a result of the experiences that they've been through, what would you suggest are three things that they can start to move towards that are going to help them break that pattern?
The first crucial thing is to get out of that cycle, is
Okay.
to spend some time looking at looking inside. You can ask yourself, okay, what happened there? What could I have done differently? What other possible um, reasons could there be for that situation to happen? Asking yourself effectively internal reflection. If you want to get out of that cycle, looking at yourself, how you reacted, how you were thinking, how you were feeling, and other possible situations or other possible scenarios for the situation. Um, Looking at the situation with kindness and gentleness to yourself and the other person is huge. Um, even if you have overreacted, or you've gone into bitch mode or victim mode, or whatever mode you've gone into, be kind to yourself. It's a response. You can learn to manage the response, and being hard on yourself is, well, quite frankly, you're just then victimizing yourself. You're
Yeah.
bullying yourself then if you're not being kind to yourself. And again, that can perpetuate the cycle. But if you try and empathize and understand yourself, be kind to yourself, be kind to the other person, um, that's a huge step
Yeah.
to coming out, and realizing that there are going to be times, even if you do really well at managing these, then there are going to be times that you slip up. We're not perfect. I'm not going to tell you I've never lost my rag or I've shouted because I've been stressed and tired and hungry and whatever. Um, I'm a human.
Yeah.
We all do it. Be kind.
Nice. So, could we simplify that to say reflection and self-awareness?
Pretty much.
Perfect. Why use 1,000 words when we can use 3?
Exactly.
But this is definitely something for me. And the second one. So we've got
Um,
reflection and self-awareness. We've started to develop
mm,
that. We realize, okay, there's more to it than just my judgments and assumptions. what's next? Where does someone start to move towards so they can start to actually step away from it and not continue with those patterns?
Acknowledge your when you're feeling it, when you're getting an emotional trigger. Acknowledge it, and you can really assess your triggers. So when you're not triggered, when things are calmed down, actually going through and looking at your triggers. When do they occur? Is there someone particular that's around you when that particular trigger happens? And you could effectively keep a journal of your triggers and try and fill in the information that's surrounding you. And at some point you will notice a pattern, and if you also look when you're writing down the trigger, this is what happened, this is what I felt, this is what I thought, and at some point you might need some help to do that, but not everybody's going to need help for it, but to then look at what you can do to constructively make sure that doesn't happen again, to unhook the trigger. A lot of the solutions and the things that you can do are actually not that difficult. It's surprisingly, I'll say simple, not necessarily easy. It's surprisingly simple to unhook triggers and to overcome traumas. You don't need years of therapy, but paying attention to what's going on, to the warnings you're being given, and then being your own little detective and having a look at what positively you can do for yourself that's going to deal with the trigger.
Okay. And then when it comes to action, is there anything you would advise there? Because for me, the greatest tool we have at our disposal is our ability to communicate. However, when we communicate, we often don't use language of personal responsibility. We sit behind blame and diagnosis and judgment, as opposed to actually it being present-based, language of personal responsibility, acknowledging our needs. How big a role does communication play?
It does play a huge role, in the sense, as you've said, be really conscious about who you talk to. And I don't mean this in a don't talk to anyone, because then you're withholding. You are really quickly going to get yourself sick by bottling it all up, and not allowing that energy to flow. And yeah, so bottling up is really not an option. Please don't do that. Talking to people who are trained at helping you look at things objectively. I know sometimes, we just need to go, this is what happened, and that's fine. If you're going to do that every day, that's not so much. But we need to express ourselves, and actually one of the most useful ways of actually resolving or avoiding an argument is to stop talking and listen to what's going on with the person. And so if you know someone who is able to sit and listen, and isn't going to jump in and tell you what to do, and isn't going to, like you said, they're not going to start trying to fix the problem. You might need some help fixing the problem, but at that moment, you're more likely to be, venting, letting it out, and just saying, "Oh, this is what you're sharing your experience." And so you talk to someone who's going to understand and validate where you are right now, and that's okay that you're experiencing that, and allow you to do that. And you don't want to talk to somebody who's then going to join you on the train, or oh yes, yeah, my so and so did that, and then get into a whole bitching session, about putting the world to rights and things. And again, that sort of thing. It's okay on occasion. It's if you're repeatedly doing it and you're getting stuck in it, that's when it becomes a problem. And how you talk to people from a position of personal responsibility and not blaming other people. I know there are a few sayings that go around that people find that are quite polarizing. People find either particularly helpful or particularly is things like it takes two to tango. You're in an abusive relationship, it takes two to tango. Well, now there are elements of truth to that because you can have someone who tries to bully you, but if you have learnt how to elegantly defend your boundaries and yourself without being aggressive, then you don't actually become victimized. So someone can try it on you, but well, okay, I hear you, and I'm not going to take it on board. However, if you don't yet know how to do that, that doesn't mean it's your fault. And let's face it, most people don't know how to do that. I learned some of it, much of it, in the police because it was my job to go into a situation, and people threw abuse at me and people said mean things, and that's okay. I understand where they're coming from. That doesn't mean I have to take it on. And yes, I get it's much more difficult when it's a family member or a loved one that says something and we take it on, especially if on a certain level, even if it's a small level, you believe or you agree with what they're saying. So that's how people can become hooked into that. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean it's your fault. So little sayings like that can be particularly unhelpful. So how you use your language, it can have an impact.
Yeah, for sure. And if people want to start addressing this, Helen, if they're like, okay, I want to let go of this mentality of victim, I want to let go of this sort of holding a space of bitchiness and over defensiveness, how would they contact you?
I'll tell you what, the easiest way to do it at the moment is to either message me directly, or maybe if someone doesn't, well, if you don't want to comment or like on the post, you could drop a comment on the post. That would be helpful if you're open to that. And if you're not, that's fine. You can just drop me a message.
Okay. Where would they
I'm
drop a message?
in the process of creating a program. So if anyone wants to join me for that, that would be fantastic.
Cool. Excellent. Helen, thank you so much for your time. If you just wait a moment,